Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
We have a massive one today. We are looking at a collision between two absolute titans of modern thought.
Yeah, we're talking about a heavyweight intellectual sparring match here.
Oh, absolutely.
In one corner, you have the neuroscientist and famous new atheist Sam Harris, and in the other, clinical psychologist and defender of ancient biblical wisdom, Jordan Peterson.
And the core tension we're diving into is massive. It's really, can science and rationality replace God?
Right, or will abandoning those ancient religious structures literally destroy society? It's essentially the ultimate battle between the software update of atheism and the operating system of tradition.
And what makes this so unique is that it isn't just a shout fest. They're actually attempting to steelman each other.
Right, which means they have to strengthen the other person's argument before they're allowed to tear it down. It is high stakes, it's incredibly dense, and honestly, it's a little intense. But before we step into the ring with them, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
So let's set the stage a bit for you. This is part 2 of their debate series in Vancouver.
Right.
The moderator is Bret Weinstein, and he opens the night with a fairly dark observation, actually.
Yeah, he argues that the sense-making apparatus of the West is breaking down.
Exactly. He's talking about how we basically can't trust the news anymore. Universities are totally polarized.
We just don't know what's true.
Right. And Weinstein's goal for this whole deep dive is to see if Harris and Peterson can somehow upgrade the conversation.
Like, can they find a way to agree on enough basic reality to stop civilization from sliding off a cliff?
And that desperation for a better conversation leads directly to that Steelman challenge you mentioned.
I love this concept so much. Usually in a debate, you do the exact opposite, right?
You build a straw man.
Exactly. You build a straw man, a silly, weak version of your opponent's view, and then you knock it over to look really smart.
Yeah, it's easy.
But Weinstein makes them do the reverse. They have to summarize the other person's views so well that the opponent actually says, yes, that is exactly what I believe.
It is a brilliant way to start, and Harris goes first. He has to summarize Peterson's defense of God.
Which is fascinating because Harris famously thinks religion is a mind virus.
Right, but he has to articulate why Peterson thinks it's completely essential, and he actually nails it.
He does. Harris explains that for Peterson, religious stories, like the Bible, they aren't just magic or bad science. They are evolutionary documents.
They encode the hard knocks wisdom of our survival over literally millions of years.
Yeah, Harris points out that Peterson believes these stories answer the deep questions that science just can't touch.
Questions like, what is worth dying for? Or how should I act in a crisis?
Right, and Peterson's fear is that if we delete these stories just because they aren't scientifically true, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
We might be deleting the very coding that keeps us from killing each other.
So Harris acknowledges that Peterson isn't some fundamentalist. He's a pragmatist. He thinks we genuinely need the myth to survive.
And then the tables turn. Peterson has to summarize Harris's atheist worldview.
And Peterson is just as precise.
He is. He explains that Harris sees humanity walking this tightrope. On one side, you have religious fundamentalism on the right.
Right, which is tyranny, dogma. It's the whole God told me to do it mentality, and you just can't argue with it.
Exactly. And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the left falling into moral relativism or nihilism, where nothing matters, there's no truth, and everything is just power games.
So Harris is basically trying to find a third way through all that.
Yeah, Peterson highlights that Harris wants to ground our values in empirical facts.
Harris believes there's a factual scientific difference between a bad life, which is misery, pain, and suffering, and a good life, which is flourishing.
He thinks we can use science and reason to tell the difference. We don't need a priest or a burning bush to tell us that agony is bad.
And the verdict on these summaries?
They both agreed. They both just nodded and said, yes, that is my position.
It was this rare moment of perfect clarity.
Which, of course, usually means the gloves are about to come off.
Oh, and they definitely do. The real fight begins over a concept called metaphorical truth.
Metaphorical truth?
Yeah, this is really the engine of the entire disagreement regarding God.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because metaphorical truth, to me, that sounds like a contradiction.
Right.
Either something is true or it's a metaphor.
Well, in a strictly scientific sense, yes. But Peterson argues there are two kinds of truth. You have Newtonian truth, which is the literal material facts.
Okay.
And then there is Darwinian truth, which asks, what do I need to believe to actually survive?
So something could be scientifically false, but Darwinially true.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And the prime example they use to fight over this concept is a gun.
Right, the basic safety rule we all know. Treat every gun as if it is loaded.
Exactly. Even if I just watched you unload it, check the chamber, and hand it over to me, I still treat it as if it's loaded. I never pointed at my friend.
Now imagine the gun is actually empty. Scientifically, literally, it is empty. That is the Newtonian truth.
But Peterson argues that treating it as if it is loaded is the truth that keeps you alive. He calls this a useful fiction.
I totally see where he's going with this. Peterson views God exactly this way.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if there's literally an old man in the sky acting as if there is a God watching you, or as if your actions have eternal consequences that protects you from catastrophe.
It's a safety mechanism. It's the safety on switch for humanity.
But here is where Harris jumps in with just a brilliant counter-analogy. It really exposes the weakness in Peterson's view.
He says, sure, that works for basic safety, but imagine a casino opens across the street.
A casino.
A casino where you can bet $1 million on whether the gun is literally loaded.
Oh, wow. That changes everything.
It completely changes the game. Harris argues that in that specific moment, you don't want a useful fiction. You want the literal truth.
Because if you know for a fact the gun is empty, you bet $1 million and you win.
Exactly. You wouldn't say, well, metaphorically, it's loaded, so I think I'll just pass on the bet. You'd be an idiot to do that.
So Harris is saying that by treating the Bible like a loaded gun when it's actually empty, we are leaving money on the table.
Worse than that. He thinks we're leaving human progress on the table.
Right.
Harris's fear is that we're tiptoeing around religious books, respecting them out of this ancient fear, when we should be checking the chamber with science.
Because we could be curing diseases, solving moral dilemmas with stem cells, actually advancing society, but we're scared of a metaphor.
That is the core conflict. Peterson says the metaphor is the absolute shield against chaos.
And Harris says the metaphor is just a blindfold preventing us from seeing reality.
And this tension gets even darker when they move on to the topic of sacrifice.
I found this part of the research so fascinating because, sacrifice usually feels so incredibly ancient.
Yeah, like killing a goat to please the rain god or something.
Exactly. It just feels like pure superstition.
It does to us now, sure.
Mm-hmm.
But Peterson tries to explain the underlying logic behind it. He argues that sacrifice was actually the human race discovering the concept of the future.
How does killing a goat help you discover the future?
You have to think about it as delayed gratification. In early agriculture, you have to save your best grain to plant for next year.
You can't just eat it now.
Right. You have to sacrifice the immediate pleasure of eating for the future reward of a harvest.
Oh, I see.
Peterson argues that humans had to learn this. It wasn't obvious to our ancestors.
So the ritual of sacrificing a prize bull was just a way of acting out this bargain. You give up something valuable now in the hope that reality gives you something better later.
Exactly. It's an investment strategy masked as a religious ritual.
That makes sense.
But Peterson goes deeper and a lot darker with this. He traces the evolution of it, arguing it started with the most valuable thing possible, human sacrifice.
Specifically, child sacrifice,
Mm.
which is just horrifying.
It is horrifying. But Peterson argues it was a desperate early attempt to bargain with reality. Like, if I give you my most precious thing, surely this catastrophe will be averted.
But over thousands of years, we sort of up-leveled this practice.
Yes. We realize maybe God doesn't want the child. Maybe an animal will do. And then eventually we moved from animals to psychological sacrifice.
Meaning we stop killing things entirely and start giving up our own bad habits.
Right. We sacrifice our immediate desires for a better long-term life.
And Peterson sees Christianity as the culmination of this whole trajectory, doesn't he?
He does. He says it takes the child sacrifice motif, God sacrificing his own son, and turns it into a story that ends physical sacrifice forever. It internalizes the whole concept.
He thinks that's a psychological miracle. But Harris wasn't buying this up-leveling narrative at all.
No, not even a little bit. Harris looks at that history and completely recoils. He argues that we don't need to respect these barbaric origins.
He actually calls Christianity a cult of human sacrifice.
Which is a very aggressive take.
Okay.
He points out that the religion didn't say human sacrifice is fundamentally wrong and we should never have done it. It said, this one specific human sacrifice was so good we don't need to do any more of them.
Wow.
So Harris argues that we can understand the value of the future, we can understand delayed gratification without dragging along all the baggage of these ancient blood rituals.
He thinks we can just use reason. We don't need the blood and the gore to learn the lesson of saving for retirement.
Exactly. He thinks Peterson is fetishizing the history, whereas Harris just wants the utility. Harris wants the software without the bloody hardware.
And this leads us to what is really the philosophical heart of the whole debate. Can you get values from facts?
The classic is ought problem.
Right. Can you look at the material world and figure out how you should live your life?
And Peterson says absolutely no. He argues that facts are dead, they don't tell you what to do. And he uses a really fun example to prove it. Elton John's glass.
Okay, paint the picture for me on this one.
So imagine a drinking glass. If you analyze it scientifically, you look at the molecules, the glass structure, the wet, you find zero actual value. It's just silica.
It's worth maybe a few cents.
Exactly. But if I tell you Elton John drank from it at his very last concert, suddenly it has immense value to a collector.
Or Elvis's guitar. The Elvisness isn't in the wood or the strings.
Right.
You can't put it under a microscope and isolate the Elvis molecule.
You really can't. So Peterson argues that value is a social agreement. It's a story we tell each other. This glass matters because Elton touched it.
Therefore, you cannot derive value strictly from material facts.
You need a story, a culture, a religion, a myth, something to assign that value. Because facts alone are cold and dead.
So Peterson is basically saying that if you strip away the stories, if you strip away God, you strip away the value. You're left with just silica and wood.
Yes. But Harris pushes back hard here. He uses what he calls the navigation argument.
Right. He says, look, we don't need a story to know that putting your hand on a hot stove is a bad idea.
Harris argues that the bad life, meaning a life of maximum suffering for everyone, is a factual baseline. It is objectively bad.
We don't need a Bible or a myth to tell us that agony is something we should avoid.
He calls it a navigation problem. We are all conscious beings. We can physically feel pain and happiness.
So Harris thinks we can navigate away from the suffering and move toward human flourishing using just our brains, our neurology, and reason.
We don't need a religious map to tell us that burning alive is bad.
And it sounds so convincing. I mean, who wants to burn alive?
Yeah.
But Peterson spots a flaw in Harris's reliance on pure reason and our natural instincts.
And this leads to what I think was actually the most disturbing part of their conversation, the limits of empathy.
Yeah, this is where Harris actually points out a bug in our own software, which, ironically, ends up helping Peterson's argument in a way.
He talks about the little girl in the well paradox.
I know this one. It's all about how our empathy just doesn't scale up.
It's a well-known psychological phenomenon. If you tell people a story about one little girl trapped in a well or a starving child with a name and a face, people will empty their wallets.
They'll cry. They'll feel immense, genuine empathy.
And this is the scary part, if you show those exact same people a news report about a genocide where thousands of people are dying, they will often just change the channel.
Right. We feel less empathy for 1,000 people than we do for one. It's this weird numerical numbness.
And Harris uses this to argue that our ancient stories and our biological instincts fail at scale. We are buggy. Our hardware just isn't built for a globalized world.
So Harris says this is exactly why we need rational, atheistic ethics. We need a system that forces us to care about the many because our natural hearts only care about the few.
He thinks we need to override our biology with data.
And Peterson's reaction.
Peterson is highly skeptical that we can just overcome our biology with pure reason. He reminds us that we evolved to care for a tribe of about maybe 150 people.
So he questions whether universal empathy is even a real possibility.
He thinks trying to force a purely rational structure that completely ignores our deep tribal nature might actually be dangerous.
He suggests that religious structures, which tap into those deep instincts but actively channel them, might be the only things holding us together.
Exactly. If you strip the religion away and just rely on cold data, you might find that people simply don't care about the genocide at all.
Without the command to love thy neighbor, maybe we just ignore the neighbor entirely.
It's the difference between how we wish we were and how we actually are. Harris wants to upgrade the software. Peterson is worried that if you mess with the code too much, you crash the entire system.
And as they move toward their closing arguments, the divide becomes so clear.
It really does.
Harris's final stance is all about the danger of the shelf of books. He says religion is this special section of the library where we just aren't allowed to ask questions.
He argues that in a world with nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, we cannot afford to have any ideas that are immune to criticism.
Right. If a book says, hate your neighbor or start a holy war, and we can't criticize it because it's divine, we are going to destroy ourselves.
He wants totally open inquiry, Everything must be on the table. Absolutely no sacred cows.
And Peterson's final stance is all about structure. He warns that you cannot view the world without a frame.
If you throw away the religious and cultural structure that basically built Western civilization, you aren't left with pure freedom. You are left with chaos.
He brings it right back to the good life. Peterson believes that even Harris's idea of a good life is just quietly borrowing from Judeo-Christian values.
He thinks Harris is basically taking the fruit of the tree, things like human rights, dignity, truth, while simultaneously trying to chop down the tree itself.
And Brett Weinstein, the moderator, wraps the whole thing up on a surprisingly hopeful note.
He observed that despite this massive disagreement, they are disagreeing on the fundamental nature of reality here, they showed incredible generosity of spirit.
They didn't scream. They didn't storm off the stage. They proved that you can have a difficult conversation about God and atheism without it turning into a war.
Which, especially in the context of the sense-making apparatus breaking down that we mentioned at the start, is a massive victory in itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So bringing this all back to you, the listener, it really comes down to a choice between two risks.
Do you prefer the safe gun of tradition Peterson's view, where we respect the old stories because they've kept us alive this long?
Or do you prefer the open inquiry of Science Harris's view, where we take the safety off and bet on our ability to figure out the literal truth, just hoping we don't accidentally shoot ourselves in the process?
It's the safety of the fortress versus the freedom of the open field. Both have their serious dangers.
And if we think back to that Elton John glass analogy, it leaves us with a really provocative final thought to mull over.
It does.
If science can look at a glass and find absolutely no value, because it's just molecules, can science really find the value in a human life?
Or do we need a story to tell us that a human being actually matters?
Because if we are just molecules, why does the genocide matter more than the girl in the well?
Science can count the bodies, but can it tell us why we should cry?
A massive question to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.